Hey gamers, this is John, host of Video Games in the World. The Fire Emblem series is one of my most favorite franchises of all time. It's one of the most loved tactical RPG games due to story, the characters, the music, and so on. The Fire Emblem series spawned many video games, manga, a 3-part anime, toys, and so on. What I also love about it is things like references to myth, legend, history, and biblical references. Today's episode is about how Path of Radiance and its sequel promote tolerance. Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn are two of my favorite titles of the Fire Emblem franchise. My other favorite, of course, is the Sacred Stones. As said, we will talk about how Fire Emblem Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn promotes tolerance, and shows us about conversations in real life that we need to have. Warning, this can contain spoilers for the stories of Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. Enjoy. In Fire Emblem Path of Radiance and its sequel Radiant Dawn, there are two races, Bjork and Laguz. The two races live in the world of Tellius. The Bjork are humans whose main weapons are swords, lances, axes, bow and arrows, and the magic arts as well. The Laguz are shapeshifting humans that fight with claws and fangs. Their tribes are the birds, hawks, ravens, and herons, dragons, and beasts, cats, tigers, lions, and wolves. The Laguz find it dishonorable to fight in their human forms and prefer to fight in their animal forms since they are more powerful in that state. The Bjork and the Laguz in Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn are constantly at each other's throats. And why is that? Let's find out. Now, why there are racial tensions between Bjork and Laguz? Well, this is due how the Bjork enslaved Laguz mainly by the Betnian Empire. The Laguz were kept as slaves by Bjork, usually as servants, bodyguards, and even gladiatorial fighters. That is a reference to how slaves in the Roman Empire were usually kept as servants, bodyguards, and also trained to fight as gladiators for the amusement of the crowds. The Laguz were enslaved long before Apostle Misaha, grandmother to Sanaki, passed the Slave Emancipation Act, freeing the Laguz from slavery in Betnian. However, many Laguz were still kept as hidden slaves and trophies by some nobles. The Laguz Emancipation Act was not well received by some people in the Betnian Senate, mainly Vice Minister Lekain. Lekain oversaw the assassination of Apostle Misaha by poisoning her and framed the herons for it. This led to the tragic Serenus Forest massacre, in which many herons died, and the sole survivors were Raphael, Raisin, and their sister, Princess Leanne. The massacre increased more racial tensions between the Bjork and the Laguz for the many centuries to come. To make matters worse, there were Laguz used for experimentation by enhancing their natural abilities, turning them into feral ones. When a Laguz becomes feral, then he or she will lose all sense of reason and consciousness. Izuka was a man who used the Laguz for experimentations. In Tellius, the Laguz have settled in the following nations: Gallia, Phoenicis, Kilvas, and Goldoa. However, racial division is still present even in Crimea. For example, many Bjork use the derogatory term subhuman in reference to Laguz. The Bjork are sometimes called humans by the Laguz to counter the subhuman insult. Contrary to the forming principle of Crimea, the Bjork country of Dane was formed when the Betnian senator Hengist felt that Betnian was becoming too Laguz friendly. Even in the present, Dane is still very anti-Laguz, and as stated by Jill, teaches his children from a young age to hate the subhumans. The dragon tribes of Goldoa are proven to be very xenophobic, as they would rather not have anyone of their fellow Laguz or Bjork enter their lands. They will also prefer to not participate in any conflict. This is due to the fact that they want to prevent a world conflict that could awaken the Dark Goddess before her 1,000-year sleep is complete, something which eventually happens in the sequel to Path of Radiance, Radiant Dawn. Examples of Laguz harboring a hatred for Bjork are Raisin and Levi, since they were witnesses to the oppression of Laguz. Skrimir was extremely bloodthirsty upon hearing the senators of Betnian being responsible for the Serenas massacre and is willing to take as many lives as he can. But those who are tolerant of Bjork are Kurthnaga, Ranulf, and Mordecai. The Lion King Canegas didn't trust the Bjork, but he forged a strong brotherly bond with Ike's father, Grail. He was also good friends with King Ramon of Crimea as well as Titania. Bjork, who are tolerant towards the Laguz, are Ike, Elinzia, Apostle Soniki, and so on. Examples of Bjork that are prejudiced towards Laguz are Lakain, Ashnard, Jared, Duke Ludwig, and most of those who support the Betnian Senate. There are also people known as the Branded Ones, humans who bear a mark due to the union between a human and a Laguz. Examples being Micaiah, Selgius, Petrine, and Soren. Although they cannot turn into animals, they are strong fighters. Ironically, Soren and Petrine show prejudice towards Laguz by calling them subhumans. Tormod is a young boy leading the Laguz Emancipation Army that fights to free all the Laguz from slavery. He is a Bjork raised by a tiger Laguz called Moirim. Now, the interesting thing about the racial tension between the two races in the game is how it reflects real life in so many different ways, both contemporarily and historically. An example on how Bjork react negative to Laguz are characters such as Shinan and Soren. Now, both are my favorite characters since they are strong in skill, but what I dislike about them in Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn is how they call Laguz subhuman. Soren stops calling them that, but Shinan still does. It's pretty analogous to how racists in real life refer to as those who were not their own as subhumans, which was sad. Real life examples are the European slave trade, the Barbary slave trade, the Nazis, and so on. There are characters who believe that both races need to work together and coexist in order to achieve true victory against the tyranny and oppression against those like Mad King Ashnard and later the senators of Betnian, led by Lakain. The best example is the main protagonist called Ike. During the beginning of the journey, he learns about the Laguz, but he and his fellow Bjork has never experienced the same type of violence and oppression that they had. However, he is willing to listen, because the game has offered us the opportunity to experience these dialogues through base conversations. With these conversations, we see Ike build his relationships on tolerance and understanding. And that is where Ike succeeds, where most nobles and world leaders in the game fail. Ike demands his Bjork mercenaries follow suit. Many of his soldiers, Bjork and Laguz alike, are forced to reconcile their prejudices as they find themselves fighting alongside the type of person they've been taught to hate and fear since they were very young. Personal arcs of characters like Gilfazard and Levi are centered around the idea that they overcome their prejudices by having a conversation and seeing the other person as a human being. And while this JRPG talks about a high fantasy war, doesn't offer any groundbreaking commentary on racism, it does have some things to say. A great leader once said that no one is born hating someone because of their race. People learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can also be taught to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than the opposite. The message is the will to listen to one another and learn from one another to promote a more accepting and tolerant society. First, fear and hatred are perpetuated by lack of knowledge and denying all form of wrongdoing. Examples: denying the Holocaust, among many other things. The bloody history of the Bjork nations has been conveniently omitted from textbooks. Dayan uses the Laguz as a scapegoat to ignite their people to war. The nation of Betnian incorrectly blames an entire race for the assassination of their empress. False rumors perpetuated by opportunistic governments spur mobs to action. Second, that healing can only happen when aggressors take responsibility for their own crimes. Persecution, slavery, genocide. It is only when rulers and nations acknowledge and take responsibility for these actions that they truly begin to make things better for the people they've oppressed. The more they deny or try to minimize their crimes, the further the divide between Bjork and Laguz grows. Of course, in real life, empires have persecuted and oppressed people. The most unfortunate thing of all is that prejudice is part of human nature. There are empires who have enslaved and oppressed other humans for centuries. The Romans, the Egyptians, the Ottomans, the Spartans, the Persians, the African Moors, Barbary slave trade, European colonists, the Nazis, Jim Crow laws, etc. I believe these things need to be taught in school so we can have better understandings on how tyrants divide people, as seen in Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. And finally, in conclusion, well, this episode to me is very thought-provoking, and I feel like I have taken a major risk, given that talks about intolerance and racism in today's world can be a very touchy subject to talk about. But I felt the need to do this episode since playing this game again on my Nintendo Wii and the dialogues in the game made me think about doing this episode. Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn are two of my favorite Fire Emblem games, not only because of gameplay, music, designs, graphics, based conversations, but also due to the powerful message of tolerance that this story gives. In order to bring true tolerance, we must have middle ground conversations rather than being one-sided without belittling anyone for being what we are, be it white, black, Latino, Asian, male, female, straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and so on. Because there are so many people who twist the message of tolerance for their own selfish gain, such as verbally and physically harassing anyone who doesn't conform to their views. What makes it even worse is that some places want to value certain demographics over others to create a more equal society, which is not exactly the best way to do so. We cannot sink to that level if we are to create a more tolerant and accepting society. A level of civility is necessary to understand each other. And that is all, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed this episode. So comment, rate, share, and subscribe. This is John, host of Video Games in the World. Have a good one. Bye-bye.